You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, nonpartisan look at a range of timely topics that matter most to business leaders. To help make sense of these topics and how they'll unfold, we'll sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best at the Conference Board, provide trusted insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland from the Conference Board and the host of this series. And in today's conversation, we're going to discuss the highlights and the takeaways from the World Economic Forum's annual meeting in Davos. Joining me today is Dr. Lori Esposito Murray, the president of the Committee for Economic Development, which is the public policy center of the Conference Board, and she is joining us from Davos. Lori, welcome.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for having me. Really looking forward to the conversation.
So, Lori, how's the skiing?
Didn't make it to the mountains, Steve, and that's actually one of the major issues that's happening. That's really important for Europe. It's a warm winter, and that's getting them through the energy crisis.
And there's no snow, and it's unusual for the group.
Right. There have been some flurries, and but in terms of actual skiing, not much happening.
Yeah. Well, the topic of this year's meeting is cooperation in a fragmented world. Wow, what a great topic. So what is the mood there? Is there pessimism about the war in Ukraine? Is there pessimism about, an impending recession in the global economy? And, where's the hope?
So it's interesting, Steve. I would say the mood is mixed. And on the economy, it's actually more uplifting than I was expecting. Europe is doing much better than they had expected. As a matter of fact, the Europeans are saying that they are actually going to have growth this year and expect to slow down in the first quarter. But in fact, it's much better than they had anticipated, and they're not calling it a recession. They're calling it, I think, a mild contraction in the first part of the year, but expect to have growth by the end of the year. So that's really interesting on the economy. And in terms of the war, that's where I think it is beginning to be widely recognized that this war isn't ending anytime soon. And, that I think is having a major impact on how to look at resilience in terms of Europe, the economy, the refugee and immigration crisis that they're going through, the worst since World War II, the impact on both societies and cultures in Europe. And of course, we had President Zelensky talking to us, as well as Madam Zelenska, who came in person, and President Zelensky was virtual. And they were hit pretty hard by the loss of the Minister of Interior, who had just passed away in that helicopter crash. Yeah,
and that's still they're still not sure what happened in that crash. But this is a place where this meeting happens once a year. You get world leaders, so you get the political side of it, and business leaders coming together, trying to talk about, the key issues of the world. So this is a pretty important meeting, and and this year is no different. Lots of different things going on. In past years, I know Russia and China have played prominent roles here. You just mentioned, that President Zelensky was there. What about President Putin?
So the Russians are out of Davos. It is a major, I think, historic turning point. It's pretty finalized, at least while this war goes on. And, the message from the Ukrainians across the board, there were a couple of ministers who were also here, was basically that the West, the US, NATO need to act now. No longer hesitate or delay on weapon systems. They need help now. And it was interesting because President Zelensky was asked what should be Russia's role in Europe. And he had he said he could not think of an answer on that. He could not imagine what Russia's role could be given what's going on in Ukraine. So the Russians are really on the outs. They are launched this aggressive war unprovoked. And it's anticipated that it's going to last a while. There's no insights or bright moments that anyone can imagine happening that would move this to the negotiating table. It's all really happening on the battlefield right now.
Yeah, but the Russians are positioning themselves as the victims here, which is a fascinating positioning. But this is an important, the optics here as well as the reality is that the rest of the world has excluded Russia, and can we call them a pariah state then? If they're completely excluded from these conversations, which I think this is the first time, right? So they're not being viewed as the victims by everybody else.
No, exactly. And they're, given the size of Russia, given the size of their economy, this is a historic moment when you have a country that is that large, that is a major energy producer, that has the 11th size economy, basically in the same position as Iran and North Korea in the global community. And for the most part, at least as far as the West, the U.S., its allies, and its partners, of course, Putin still has very important relationships with China, Xi Jinping, and Modi in India. But getting to the fractured world. But as far as Russia's role, they are out right now, and it's not going to change until there is some resolution of the tragedy in Ukraine.
Yeah, so cooperation in a fragmented world, and now global unity was fragmented, and as you say, fractured, which is an even more dramatic word, before the war, and of course before everybody kind of picked sides on this thing. There seem to be now divisions between economic blocs and so forth. So what are you hearing in terms of how this resolves? Whether there can be concerted action by everybody else? We've got the sanctions that went on almost a year ago, and then they were tightened several times. Where's it going?
Well, the two interesting stories are China and India coming out of Davos, in my opinion. So with China, the vice prime minister, premier was here, Liu He, and he's met with Secretary of Treasury Yellen. They committed to making sure that they could cooperate on global issues that were in our mutual interest, and would work to prevent the relationship from ever turning into a full conflict. Secretary Yellen also announced that she's going to China. So on the part of the Biden administration and the U.S., it is clearly trying to work, as well as the interest from the Chinese, on at least repairing the relationship, or at least the dialogue between the two countries. So that's really interesting on China. And I also think we're not going to get any closure, positive closure on what's happening in Ukraine without China and India involved. The India story at Davos is even more interesting. There are even some people saying that this is the Indian decade, that the big winner coming out of these dual crises of the pandemic and what it's done to supply chains, and the rethinking in terms of China's zero COVID policy to look for supply chains and manufacturing elsewhere, plus what's happening, obviously the impact of the war and the reevaluation of our entire relationship with China. This India is coming out, really the most excitement, the most positive assessment is really coming from the rest of Asia, and particularly India. And they are really trying to leverage taking advantage of the rest of the world's search for alternative markets and alternative manufacturing to really push their economy forward.
I just want to go back to Ukraine for one more minute, if you don't mind. How are the Europeans coping with this situation? Because they have a lot of energy and food that have come from combined Russia and Ukraine, those supply lines have been damaged, and so forth. How do they see this resolving? I mean, can we negotiate something here and get this over with? Is it going to linger? How does it go from here?
So the most important insight from the Europeans, and the Europeans have suffered, they don't consider this a war in Ukraine, they consider this a war on Europe as well. They're not narrowing it to Ukraine. They are suffering a high inflation, they are suffering on energy, they're working really hard to keep their population from having the most severe impacts from what's going on. the weaponization of energy on the part of Russia and Putin is the impact really is in Europe. And so they are part of this war. That's how they see themselves. The Europeans actually have the strategic historic perspective that this is not just a war in Ukraine, that the impact is very, very large. The global order is in transformation. The question is, how are we going to come out of this? And how can we make sure that we come out of this? We, meaning the US, its allies, its partners, and the US and Europe. How do we come out of this stronger with a better world order as opposed to a worse world order, which is where we are right now?
And what's the answer to that? I mean, how does it end? What are you hearing?
So they actually recognize that this isn't ending anytime soon. And so what you have to do is really go through major transformations within your own economy in terms of where you're going to find your supply chains, where they're coming from, that resilience that you need for your own economy. They are completely focused on climate change and clean energy, and completely converting with a real strong commitment their entire energy source. So they're not dependent on authoritarian governments that are fossil fuel producers, that they can actually become independent energy producers through solar, wind, hydrogen, a lot of emphasis on hydrogen. So if you free yourself from the economic trap of being energy dependent, that's a major transformation. And so both the leaders of von Leyen, who is the president of the EU, and Chancellor Scholz of Germany, both talked about Ukraine and pivoted to their climate, their green energy programming as the way out of this trap of dependency, and where the future is going, and becoming more self-sufficient in terms of clean energy sources coming out of the North Sea, as well as sharing energy resources among themselves with the US, and also conservation. That part of their success is because their populations are actually contributing to conservation on energy.
Yeah, well, but you also have the great show with Greta Thunberg being carried out by the German police. So at the coal mine, because they're reopening up old energy sources that are in order to keep the lights on.
And that's a really interesting point, Steve, because as part of CED's analysis on the how do you reach these climate goals by 2050 that we've committed to is that you have to recognize that fossil fuels are part of the energy source, at least in the near term, if not in the midterm. And it's interesting that that's pretty much recognized, I think, throughout Europe.
Yeah, that's becoming clear. I mean, you can't just shut everything off before you have another source, and they haven't, with renewables, they haven't figured out a way for storage to deal with the episodic nature of renewables. So therefore, you need to replace fossil fuels essentially with nuclear in order to get carbon free, in order to provide the base load for all of the renewables. And there's more. I know that there's more talk there about nuclear than there has been in the past.
Right. And also in terms of lessons learned, obviously, Germany is the case study in how not to do the transition, and has pretty much laid out a strategic plan on having learned those lessons on how to do the transition and how to do it smoothly, or how to at least work to do it smoothly. It's going to be difficult. They recognize it's going to be difficult. They recognize it's going to be expensive. And obviously, it's really about research and development, accelerating, research and development on these clean energies. There's optimism that we're going to actually get there in terms of technology sooner than had originally been anticipated on these new technologies, which is also an interesting part of the discussions here.
We're talking about Davos with Dr. Lori Esposito Murray. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back.
As you and your company monitor the volatile and uncertain economy, the award-winning forecast team at the Conference Board predicts a downturn by the end of 2022. Recession will further compound the crises that have recently upended expectations, from a deadly pandemic to a war in Ukraine and the highest inflation in decades. Yet, unprecedented crises also present unforeseen opportunities if you have a trusted, proven navigator by your side. With that in mind, and as the Conference Board has always done, we are providing you with daily, timely, and relevant content that will guide the business community through the economic storm. These trusted insights are being gathered on our website and are available to help your company master the challenges. To find out how you can chart a course for the future which will allow your business to emerge stronger on the other side, visit our free economic hub entitled Navigating the Economic Storm, your indispensable guide through the global recession, located at conference-board.org/topics/recession.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland from the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Dr. Lori Esposito Murray, the president of the Committee for Economic Development, the Public Policy Center of the Conference Board, who is at Davos. Okay, so Lori, let's go back to China for a moment. You mentioned the Chinese delegation and so forth. What are they saying? What are you hearing about China, Taiwan?
Well, first of all, when the vice premier made his speech, he was very optimistic about the Chinese economy and very much selling to the business audience that China is open for business and to invited everyone to come visit and to come into China, which, given their zero COVID policy and how they just flipped that switch, that was his messaging, that China is open for business. And,
I wonder if did he talk to President Xi before he made that speech? Do you think?
Well, we'll find out in terms of whether he goes home or not. But in any case, that was. But the Taiwan issue, and Steve, I will use the word surprised. I was surprised how it's almost pervasive, the understanding of the linkage between what's happened in Ukraine and how that really puts the Taiwan problem at the top of the agenda in terms of global problems or disruption that could happen. There's real recognition of that and real recognition to prevent that from happening, which is why the Secretary Yellen's statement on the Treasury Department statement on Secretary Yellen's meeting, that quote that we will work very hard to make sure that this relationship never turns to one of conflict. That's not the exact wording, but not having it be one of conflict is, it's just another checkpoint of the recognition of the role that Taiwan can play in terms of disruption, and how probable it deserves to be up high on the global challenges list.
Yeah, but any sense of whether that's going to become a kinetic situation?
Well, I think there's recognition that it is a volatile situation and a very serious problem, but also recognition that we need to start opening those diplomatic channels to be making sure that it doesn't flip that switch.
Yeah. And then you got to turn to the U.S. delegation. Who's there for the U.S. and what are they saying?
Well, this is the most interesting story of all. In any prior Davos that I had,
as an American,
yes, as an American, any prior Davos I had attended, it was really the U.S. leadership in the world that was how the U.S. was discussed. What is so fascinating about this time is, and should really be surprising to most Americans, is that the hottest, biggest issue is the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a piece of legislation that has actually come out of Congress. I don't think I've ever been at a Davos where a U.S. congressional action has caused so much attention, an actual law. Usually it's U.S. policy on the foreign policy front and whatever. But now the focus is on the IRA. The Europeans are mad about the IRA. They see it as industrial policy. They're being cut out. We saw it actually a foreshadowing of this, obviously, when President Macron was visiting Washington. But it really is the issue. There was a panel discussion where the Europeans were saying how shocked they were by the IRA, and it's the American
IRA being the act.
Yeah, the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah.
And it's that the U.S. is being protectionist. They're cutting Europe out, which has an irony in and of itself in terms of complaining about U.S. industrial policy. But in any case, they're saying that. So part of it is the American content piece of the bill, but also the fact that it had tax incentives, which means, as opposed to subsidies, because they're tax incentives, the decisions and progress is going to be made, particularly the decisions in this area are going to be made much more quickly because they immediately come into force in terms of companies making decisions, whereas subsidies take longer in terms of how they roll out. And so the result has been that while complaining about the Inflation Reduction Act, they are recognizing that it is a major, major piece of legislation as far as climate action is concerned, and how the U.S. is going to approach it in terms of its economy, and that they are going to have their own IRA. And
I'm confused. Which portions of the act do the Europeans believe are protectionist? What are they concerned about?
They're mostly concerned about the American content, how you have to have U.S. content in the development of these technologies and in the scale up and the rollout. So that prohibits their companies from being part.
They think it would be better if we put all these technologies back in China so that we could be disintermediated again.
I think they I don't think they care as much about China as they hoped that Europe would be where that companies will end up end up working out of the U.S., not relocating to Europe because the advantages are better for them.
But they have the same rules and protections built in there, and the same issues. So.
And this gets to the point that they are actually going to then even go further, have their own industrial policy to mirror the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. And what you're seeing in terms of the economy is that we really are all moving towards industrial policies, which means, it's going to have a major impact on, it's the opposite of globalization. It's the opposite of open trade is happening. And you're going to see this Europe go even further.
Well, of course, but this comes back to Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan, because if globalization only works in a peaceful world where everybody is following WTO rules and it's all done evenly, but when you start militarizing industrial policy and you've got the concentration of chips, for example, in Taiwan and the concentration of communications gear, electronics gear, and everything else in China, it becomes a risk, and China can turn that off and therefore do great damage. So isn't this just really a realization that we're not quite as on the same page across the globe as it's required?
Well, yes, and definitely national security is playing a much larger role in decision making among all the governments as a result of COVID. The global pandemic and its impact on supply chains and the availability of the components you needed to keep your economies running and to keep your public health running in terms of whether you're developing vaccines, having the materials for that, the PPE during the crisis. So yes, but it's also recognized that if we are going to go forward globally and continue to grow, trade has to stay an important part of that. So here's your conflict on, how do you deal with these supply chain issues? And so Europe, I think the reason why they have responded with such shock and ire, as opposed to shock and awe, shock and ire, is because if we are breaking into blocks, and that is also one of the major themes, that we can't break into a G2, two blocks, they see the Inflation Reduction Act as cutting them out of the block that they should be in.
Yeah, very interesting. What's been surprising to you? You've talked a couple of surprises, but what other surprises have come out of Davos?
So I think it's India. I think it's the positive, the optimism. The Indian delegation is very, very large. I mean, they have a very huge presence here. They're participating in all the meetings. They are clearly, they want to see themselves as a chips manufacturing hub for the world. They're committed to that in terms of advanced manufacturing and the role that they can play in the new technologically advanced economy. The optimism about this really is their time for growth. They're going to see growth. They've got the world's largest population, very well-educated population. Just how attractive they are as a hub for companies across the sectors.
Yeah, it's interesting too. In the Conference Board's consumer confidence indices, which we measure around the world, India's the highest in the world. So it sounds like there's a little bit of nationalist pride and just cultural optimism here baked in as well.
Yeah, and I would caution and actually share this with one of the Indian CEOs, the delegate to the to Davos, to the World Economic Forum's annual meeting. I actually shared with him the assessment that, having heard the presentations on India, that the only at this point, the only thing that will hurt India is India. If they don't actually pursue more open policies in terms of investment, foreign investment coming in, and how they open up their economy, and whether they open up their economy, that it really is up to them whether they can take advantage of what's happening.
Yeah, they're a nation of shopkeepers, and they're very protective of those mom and pop businesses, and don't, they view foreign direct investment as a bit of a threat. But the other threat is geopolitical. I mean, they've kind of thrown in here a little bit with Russia, and so you have the rest of the world kind of scratching their heads. It's easier when you know whether someone's friend or foe, and you can identify that, and so. India tries to straddle it all, but so far they've been successful at it, haven't they?
Oh yes, they were very successful. They were the leaders of the non-aligned during the Cold War, during the entire Cold War, and so this isn't something that it isn't a strategy they have to create out of whole cloth. They know how to do this, and they are, though, the oldest democracy in terms of oldest and largest. And so, there is a natural alignment there, but it is, and they know how to play that straddling role, which also enhances where they are in terms of importance, in terms of diplomacy in this world that we're in, and will continue to be one of crises and chaos, at least in the near term.
Wrapping up, any other interesting sessions, interesting tidbits, gossip that you'd like to share with us?
So I have to admit, my favorite part. This happened in the first Davos since COVID, and it was a repeat again this year. And it actually shows where my proclivity was the discussion with Henry Kissinger. He's not quite 100 yet, but he is still a brilliant mind, whether you agree with him or disagree with him. Hearing his strategic assessment of where we are and how we need to proceed forward is just my favorite piece of this entire week.
And here I thought you were going to talk about the fondue.
Henry Kissinger fondue.
It's all a melting pot. Lori Esposito Murray, thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you, Steve. Really appreciate it.
And thanks to all of you for listening in to CEO Perspectives. Every week, I'll be joined by a prominent thought leader to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover leading topics in geopolitics, economics, public policy, ESG, and more. Please share CEO Perspectives with your colleagues, with your friends, with your family. I know they're going to want to listen. I'm Steve Odland, and this series has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You've been listening to a podcast from the Conference Board, the indispensable ally that has helped businesses through war, recession, and economic transformation for over 100 years. As recent unexpected economic challenges persist, you can chart a course for the future which will allow your business to emerge stronger on the other side. Just visit our free economic hub entitled Navigating the Economic Storm, your indispensable guide through the global recession. located at www.conference-board.org/topics/recession.